Mary Judson was a fascinating figure and someone incredibly important in not only the women's college history, but Furman's history.
Women just had so much lower a place, and it's people like Mary Judson that changes that place.
She was born in Connecticut in the 1820s, and her father believed in educating her, so she had a private tutor who had recently graduated from Yale University.
She took classes at Yale, but she was never allowed to enroll. And I think that being denied by Yale as a young woman influenced the rest of her life.
The whole idea of women being educated was highly controversial. And what we have to remember is that there were real fears of race suicide if too many women became educated.
During this time period, there was this sort of agreement that even if we think that women should pursue higher education, we are going to carefully guard what that education looks like in terms of these ideals of femininity.
She believed that women should be educated as much as men should. And I think that this is the driving thing in her life.
She eventually comes down to upstate South Carolina because her brother, Charles, was teaching at Furman.
So when Mary Judson comes in 1860, and she teaches there for a couple of years, and they really like her, but the school is having problems.
Well, certainly some of the trials that the Women's College almost always faced were financial in nature. It was established in 1854 by the South Carolina Baptist Convention. But unlike Furman, it didn't actually receive any money from the convention.
There's no endowment of the school. There's no money at all. The Baptists don't give any money. So where's it going to come from? And as a result, Mary Judson's salary in 1860 was $600 a year, and her salary in 1910 was $600 a year.
During this time, there were a lot of tensions that were being negotiated. So even where institutions would allow women to attend, they were still oftentimes negotiating the ideals of white Southern womanhood in their curriculum.
The rules and regulations that governed their lives were total. They were going to be chaste young women when they were delivered to their hopefully future husbands. They could not receive letters from young men. They could not visit with young men. All of their money was deposited with the president, and they could not go downtown or leave the campus, and they went to church twice every Sunday.
One aspect of the Women's College that I find fascinating was the campus, because the campus was such a reflection of society's views on white women at that time period. It was a series of interconnected buildings. So you could live there in this building, take classes in this building, eat in this building, exercise in this building, socialize in this building's parlors, never actually leave.
The fact that she was the first person to introduce calisthenics in the South is really quite remarkable at this really quite dreadful little school.
Mary Judson introduced basically exercising. She encouraged them to throw off their corsets and move more freely.
And they had ribbons and hoops, and they thrust them around, and their arms were going and their bodies were moving, and Baptist ministers thought it was dancing. They were horrified. She introduces elocution so that women can talk, and for so many women as well as men, the idea of women talking in public was simply not done.
Traditionally, you would have women appear in public 3 times. This would go back well into the colonial period. Perhaps when they were born, there would be a mention of their birth, when they married, and when they died.
Not only did they talk in public, they debated, because she starts the Judson Literary Society. Now, the Judson Society is the first women's organization not only in Greenville, but just about in the whole state.
Debating clubs were, in general, lively gathering of either community folks or college members for the purposes of education, argumentative clash, working through the dominant political, economic, and social issues of the day.
They gathered together, they would perform research on different topics, they would write papers, they gave public addresses, the students debated each other.
Resolved, a woman should have an education equal to a man's. Resolved, long engagements are better than short engagements. Not everything was very, very serious.
And this was very controversial to a lot of men in society, to a lot of white women in society, to Baptist ministers, and she did it anyway.
And we also should remember that Mary Judson is straddling what we would call the progressive period in American history, when women were beginning to enter the mainstream. They were suggesting their usefulness to society.
This was also during a time where the women's suffrage campaign is gaining a lot of momentum nationally. And this was not something that was widely supported by white women in the South, and especially white women in South Carolina. She would encourage students to select topics for their final papers, arguing why women should have the right to vote.
Now, she didn't say it out loud, and she surely did not say it to the trustees. But the women who were there, who were her students, believed it. And as a result of that, at the turn of the century, you have the beginnings of the women's suffrage movement at the female college. And there's no question about it. That's where almost all of their meetings were held. Now, by this time, of course, Mary Judson is very, very old. She's still teaching 6 courses of English and then 1 of astronomy.
If any of the instructors felt unprepared to teach any of the classes, she would just fill in and teach the class. She is just about everything into the college.
Finally, in 1913, when David Ramsey had just become president, and he just couldn't deal with an 84-year-old woman teaching 6 courses.
And this really speaks to how well-loved she was. She continued to live at the college, and she died there. She died about a month and a half, 2 months, after women were able to vote in the presidential elections for the very first time.
She believed in women. She believed women should have more rights. And that's really what she was about.
She was a remarkable woman, and she brought this incredible sense of New England discipline and fortitude. She introduces this to these Southern, white, genteel, mid-19th century, Victorian era young women.
Women like Mary Judson were the ones who made it possible for women to receive a first-rate education finally at Furman.
I believe she's still a role model now. It's an inspiration. Any Furman person who holds themselves to such a high standard and demands that of all others is worth our admiration.